Welcome back, and we're now going to conclude this series of videos with the description of the work by the German philosopher Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy. One thing I want to mention just prior to starting this, I want to go back to the picture that you have open on page 249 of your Harris-Platzner textbook. Remember that that's the picture of the bowl with the boat that's at the base of the bowl. So that is the story that is described in the hymn to Dionysus, in which pirates kidnap him because he has beautiful curly hair and he's very attractive. They tried to bind him when they get him on board the ship, but they discover that the shackles do not hold him. They fall off. And in fact, that also happens in Euripides' play VIII, when Pentheus takes the stranger prisoner, and the same thing, the shackles fall off of him. That's also something that's in the New Testament with regard to Jesus. So you have Dionysus on board this ship, and there was the pirate pilot of the ship who tried to warn the other pirates, don't take him, but he was not listened to, and he should have been. What Dionysus then does is to fill the ship with wine, turn the mast into a vine, and as all the men jump overboard in horror, because a lion gets on board the ship and runs and scares everybody, as all the men jump overboard trying to flee, Dionysus turns all of them into dolphins, and those are the dolphins that you see there. So this is an example in this ship of the destruction of a civilized, if you can call piracy civilized, a civilized order that's in place, in this case with the ship. The ship itself is completely mutilated by Dionysus' presence, with the grapes and the vine that replace the mast, and the wine that fills the keel of the ship, and the lion that runs on board, and then finally all of these men who are turned into dolphins. So Dionysus' effect, his presence, is transformative and destructive of some previous order that was in place. By the way, the pilot who correctly guessed who Dionysus was and warned everybody is rewarded instead of punished the way that all of the other ones are. So, so that element of disturbance of a social order is what underpins the work Birth of Tragedy by Nietzsche. This was one of the earliest philosophic works that Nietzsche wrote. It was not popular in its day, and it was in fact highly criticized after he wrote it. It probably was one of his first works written, a work of his youth, where he didn't necessarily have his ideas of philosophy grounded yet. And in fact, Nietzsche, in some ways, disavowed himself of this work when he became much more mature later. Still, though, even if we can't necessarily ascribe reality to it with relation to the Greeks as they composed tragedy, it's still interesting to see his conception of the psychic background of Apollo and Dionysus as it pertains to the art of tragedy, as Nietzsche at that time perceived it with the ancient Greeks. So as we talked about in the Apollo video, Apollo is the one who keeps order. So therefore, Apollo is the part of one's mind and soul that is attempting to keep things all in a proper semblance of rationality. The difficulty with that, though, is that if somebody tries to be too hard to be rational, like Pentheus does in Euripides' VIII, also the figure of Hippolytus in that title play by Euripides, what happens then is that one is not properly in touch with one's own proper psyche, with one's own needs, as it were, and eventually those needs are apt to tear one apart or separate oneself from proper civilization in a way that will ultimately lead to one's ruin. So being too rational, hyper-rational, being afraid of one's tendencies inside one leads to tragedy of one type, even though Apollo's proper establishment of law and order is useful in many ways. It does not work out well if it's carried to an extreme. Dionysus, on the other hand, as we said before, is the chaotic element, the one that tears everything apart, like in the picture you see in the book in front of you, the bull. Now, Dionysus, therefore, can represent the capacity to be free, to live life to its fullest. But once again, carried to an extreme, that becomes destructive because the proper effects of civilization that are needed to keep law and order in place and not cause people to just hurt each other in any old way that they like. Remember now with Percy's Hesiod's brother in that respect. Dionysus' mania can be carried to an extreme to the point of causing massive destruction everywhere with anarchy, where nobody respects the rule of law, and all is just totally out of control and cannot be repaired. So what Nietzsche calls for in Birth of Tragedy, and what he says a tragedy was trying to demonstrate, was the need for the very careful balance between the rational Apollo and the irrational Dionysus. So one can have one's real moments of profound spirituality and a sense of ecstasy and wonder. He uses the example of the Ode to Joy by Schiller, the one that became the basis for the final movement of Beethoven's famous Ninth and Final Symphony. One can be spiritually uplifted to the skies in being in a state of ecstasy like that, but that doesn't mean run around crazily doing everything anybody wants to. When one undergoes that kind of spirituality with Dionysus, and even the forms of ecstasy that you get with Apollo, like at the Delphic Oracle, when the Pythia becomes manic herself as she gives the answer, and there's a kind of mania that might take over the querent. Both of those are meant to be in proper balance in order to allow one to temper one's rationality with a bit of free-spiritedness, one sense of justice with a sense of mercy, and therefore be able to know how to treat one's fellow human beings appropriately and properly, have fun with them, but also observe proper societal norms in their appropriate places. In the case of Apollo, of course, he has ecstasy because, as was mentioned in chapter 7 on Delphi, there were these vapors coming up geologically in the mountain under where the Delphic Oracle was placed that may have been creating some of the madness there. So that's why Apollo could be connected with madness. In the case of Dionysus, obviously the wine itself can be connected with madness. So the sense of ecstasy, of temporarily losing one's consciousness of one's own self, allows one to have new experiences outside one's usually accepted norms, and therefore have new insights and and experiences that can carry one to improve civilization in many ways that would not have been possible otherwise. Again, that's great as long as it leads to a positive force, but tragedy occurs when you have the imbalance between the rational and the irrational, too much of one, too much of the other, hubris resulting with somebody exceeding one's bounds or becoming overbearing in some respect or shaming someone in public in some way, whatever that might be, that eventually leads to an irreparable tragic result. So that's the overview from chapters 7 and 8 on Apollo and Dionysus. And in the next video in this series of book videos, we'll be going into the subject of death in chapter 9. Obviously, the most extreme tragedy one can suffer is death, as we see with Dionysus and Pentheus. And we'll be turning now to the whole vision of death that the Greeks had for themselves as mortals. Okay, we will see you next video.